May I speak in the name of our loving, liberating, and life-giving God. Amen. Please be seated. Like a lot of kids around here, I was a very busy high schooler, and my interests were diverse. Environmental club and lacrosse, marching band and acolyting, the student group on race relations and field hockey, jazz band and church choir, babysitting and swimming, assisting the biology department, and, oh yes, school. Somehow, despite this flurry of activity, I was never involved in theater. Except for that one time, and to this day I don't know how this happened, I ended up singing in a chorus for the school production of Rent. And so, every time I find myself celebrating the new year, be that on January 1st or today, as the church celebrates the Christian New Year with the first Sunday of Advent, this song plays over and over again in my head. 525,600 minutes, 525,000 moments so dear, 525,600 minutes. How do you measure a year? At 15, I already felt so keenly the conundrum of time, slipping through our fingers too quickly, grading along too slowly, ever unfolding moment by moment, an unstoppable, inevitable blossoming into an unknowable tomorrow. Despite Einstein's famous words, for us physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is only an illusion, however persistent. This persistent illusion is a defining feature of our experience of life. And the truth is, those who have followed in Einstein's footsteps have not had much luck unlocking the secrets of time. Liesl Randall is a professor of physics at Harvard University, whose research focuses on dark matter, that difficult-to-observe stuff that makes up most of the universe. In a recent interview, she was invited into an open-ended reflection on the nature of time, as our conversation partner mused that time is one of those most interesting, profound places where scientists just see the world differently than ordinary folks. In response, Dr. Randall simply said, "Oh, I would just say that nobody understands time," and swiftly changed the subject. We know that time moves in one direction, that it's warped by movement and gravity, but even for those who speak the language of particle physics and gravity waves, Higgs bosons and fundamental equations, time remains largely a mystery. Coming at this from a completely different perspective, Craig Minowa, a lay philosopher who created and sings with the alternative rock band Cloud Cult, crafted the album Light Chasers around this notion of timelessness. This collection of songs was put together to mirror a journey in which, in his words, a crew decides to go off into space and look for God, look for the light at the end of the tunnel until they find it. And in the end, all hope is gone. The fuel is gone, everything is spent, and there's nothing there. And it's not until that moment of ultimate surrender and apology, laying down their protective layers of self, this ultimate moment of fragility, where love is able to come out of their skin. And then for a moment, they recognize, oh, was it there all along? And did we have to travel through the universe to find it? And so in those brief moments, we get in touch with that power, but it's brief. So his question is, how do we practice to make that more prominent in our lives? How can we practice to make that more prominent as a culture and as a global family? The truth is, I think faithfully entering into the season of Advent is a pretty good answer to those very big questions. How do we make that love that seems always beyond, so far away, so compelling that we would scour the universe to find it and know it, only to find it and know it within ourselves already? How do we make that love more prominent in our individual and collective lives? Maybe we can start by practicing Advent, not so much celebrating it, but practicing it. Every world religion affirms some version of this basic truth about time, that we are most ourselves, most at peace, most open to the mysteries of the universe and the very presence of God when we are in the present moment most fully. Jesus' version of this is simple, and we hear it throughout the Gospels. Keep awake. This is less a warning than an invitation. Keep awake, because there are things about this world and this life we do not understand. Keep awake, because God is at the door, on the threshold, on the very horizon. Keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. Today's gospel is a kind of apocalyptic prophecy. What makes biblical prophecy compelling is that it seems very true in very particular ways at very particular moments in history, and yet is general enough to transcend any one time or place. Let's take this passage from Mark as an example. On the one hand, Mark is echoing the prophetic promise of a coming Messiah found throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. But if we understand Jesus to be that Messiah, the Son of God, this prophecy has already been fulfilled in him. In another sense, more present, Jesus was speaking then and now about what will happen after his arrest, crucifixion, and death, which immediately follow this passage in Mark's gospel. Jesus is predicting his own resurrection. The prophecy fulfilled in him already will be fulfilled yet again very soon. And in a third way, Christians have long since understood passages like this to speak to a second coming of Christ. Not only did Christ come in Jesus, revealed once for all in the resurrection, but he will come again to gather all things back into the fullness of God's embrace. And in this sense, the prophecy still contains a promise, what theologians call the not yet of apocalyptic literature. Thus, prophecy speaks to the past, the present, and the future, all at once, transcending, in a sense, that persistent illusion of time. We tend to find prophecy most compelling when it strikes this delicate balance between specificity and timelessness. Jesus said, in those days after that suffering, in those days after the exile, after the captivity, after the fall of the temple, in those days, after the persecutions, after the alienation, after the separation from the Jewish community, in those days, after the hurricanes, after the injustice, after the school shootings. The first noble truth of Buddhism is that all life is suffering. And our whole notion of original sin or original brokenness seeks to articulate a similar sentiment, that suffering is a given in life. We can mediate it, manage it, become more mindful in our approach to it, but there will be suffering. So there's this universality at the outset of Jesus' prophecy, a broad generality. And yet, what can be more personal to us than our suffering? Our grief, our disappointment, the weakening of a body as it ages, the discouragement of illness, the pain of love lost, the tragedy and nobility of being human in the face of an imperfect world. After that suffering, in that suffering, beyond that suffering, keep awake. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was a celebrated public theologian of the 20th century. He was a prolific writer, a social justice advocate, and a faithful Jewish leader. Reflecting on the Holocaust, he once famously said, "The opposite of good is not evil, it is indifference." And after marching with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Selma, He quipped that it felt like his legs were praying. In addition to embodying this active and activist-oriented faith, Heschel was something of a mystic, deeply rooted in the wisdom of his tradition, a committed and devoted student and teacher of Torah. I find him at his most poetic when he writes about the Sabbath, the day of rest commended to all people throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, hallowed by God in the first creation story in Genesis. In his book, The Sabbath, Heschel talks about the Christian practice of building sanctuaries, like this one, our tendency to hallow a particular location, to consecrate or set aside sacred spaces for intentional encounters with God. The Sabbath, he argues, is similar but different. It is a sanctuary in time, a hallowing of a particular natural cycle from darkness to darkness, 7 cycles around the sun, a jubilee every 49 years, set aside as a holy container for encounters with the divine mystery at the heart of all things. Sabbaths are the great cathedrals of the Jewish faith, invulnerable to wear and tear and decline, impenetrable to those who would tear down a religion's relics. As a deep believer in and committed practitioner of a weekly Sabbath, I find something deeply resonant in Heschel's writing. And though Christianity has not emphasized the discipline of Sabbath as much as it might, I think Advent invites us to reconsider our relationship to time in a very similar way. Here we are, beginning a new year, filled with expectation and anticipation as we draw nearer and nearer to the manger with each passing week. But how do we wait? In the mid-90s, when the hit movie Titanic was released, evening shows did running commentaries on that terribly tense scene where the captain is trying to maneuver the ship around the giant iceberg before him, sweat dripping down his temples as haunting music grew increasingly tense in the background. The punchline was always the same. Spoiler alert, they hit the iceberg. We are not asked in Advent to wait as though we don't know what lies ahead. Spoiler alert, Jesus is going to be born in that manger yet again. Instead, we're invited to reframe our very relationship with time, hallowing it, consecrating it, practicing this new ancient discipline of creating a sanctuary in minutes, hours, days, weeks, and then entering that vast cathedral, that spacious room, with a heart open to the good news we have inherited. Christ was born, and the good news ahead of us. Christ will come again, and even the good news right before us. Christ is breaking into this moment, even now, even here, even in our fallow hearts, our unpromising world. We might be surprised to realize that there is salvation in this practice, healing in God's gracious hospitality, as fully available to us in a cathedral in time as between these sturdy walls. Just a few years before Craig Minowa wrote Light Chasers, the album I described earlier, his first son, Caden, then 2 years old, didn't wake up one morning. He went to bed healthy and happy, energetic and enlivening, and slipped away from his family in the night. Caden's death devastated his parents, setting them to questioning and searching as they generously and wrenchingly shared their grief through their music. After years of praying and writing and singing, as he reflected on that loss and on the themes of the album, he said, "You can search as far as you want to search, and you can journey as far as you want to journey, and you'll ultimately end up right here, right now. Somehow, that gives me hope." Christ has come. Christ will come. and Christ is coming, even here, even now. Somehow, this gives me hope too. Amen.